Some moments change everything in an instant. A simple drive home takes an unexpected turn, and one decision sets off a chain reaction that no one saw coming. How will this night end? Let us know in the comments below. The glow of city lights flickered against the windshield as Penelope Richardson drummed her fingers against the leather steering wheel. Music pulsed from the car's speakers, but she wasn't really listening. She was too lost in thought, running through the events of her day. An A on her physics quiz, her best friend Kayla's endless chatter about prom, and the growing excitement of finally heading to college in a few months. It was all supposed to be so simple. Just another night, another drive, another moment of teenage freedom. The hum of the engine beneath her hands was smooth, effortless. Her father's car, a sleek black Mercedes-AMG, glided through the streets like a shadow. She barely touched the gas pedal, yet the power was undeniable. She loved this car. Not just because of how it looked or how it felt, but because of what it represented. Success, hard work, the life her father built from nothing. Then, suddenly, the glow of red and blue lights exploded in her rearview mirror. Her stomach clenched. Not again. She swallowed hard, gripping the steering wheel tighter as her pulse pounded in her ears. This was the third time this month. She hadn't run a red light, she hadn't been speeding, she hadn't even switched lanes without signaling, but none of that mattered. She flicked on her blinker, checked her mirrors, and carefully eased onto the shoulder. A deep breath, then another. Her father always told her what to do in situations like this. Hands on the wheel, no sudden movements. Yes sir, no sir, keep your voice calm, steady. It never made a difference. The patrol car came to a stop behind her, its headlights blinding through the rearview mirror. Penelope's hands were already at 10 and 2, her phone sitting in the cup holder beside her, recording. A shadow moved beyond the glare of the lights, growing larger, heavier with each step. Then, a firm knock against the glass. She took another breath and rolled down the window. A white officer leaned down, peering inside. Late 40s, crew cut, broad shoulders. His expression was unreadable, but his posture told her everything. "License and registration," he said, voice flat. Penelope nodded slowly. "It's in my glove compartment. I'm going to reach for it now." The officer didn't say anything, but his fingers twitched near his holster. Moving deliberately, she opened the compartment and retrieved the documents, handing them over. He barely glanced at them before looking her up and down. "This your car?" There it was. Penelope met his eyes, refusing to look away. "It belongs to my father." The officer exhaled sharply, standing up straight as he examined the vehicle. His partner had stepped out of the squad car now, a younger man, maybe mid-30s, arms crossed over his chest, eyes narrowed. "This is a pretty expensive ride," the first officer muttered. She knew what he meant. She knew what they both meant. "I'm aware," she said evenly. The officer's jaw tensed. "Step out of the vehicle." Penelope blinked. "Why?" "Step out of the vehicle." Her pulse slammed against her ribs. She had a choice. Comply and pray this didn't escalate, or ask for an explanation and risk pushing them too far. She knew how this went. They wanted her scared. They wanted her small. She unbuckled her seatbelt and stepped out. The cold night air wrapped around her as the officers took a step back, their hands resting near their belts. The older one circled the car, his eyes scanning every inch of it, while the younger officer focused on her. "Where are you coming from?" he asked. "My friend's house." "Where's that?" "Midtown." "And where are you headed?" "Home." He nodded slowly, lips pressing into a thin line, like he was waiting for her to slip up, like he was expecting her to crack under pressure. "Mind if we take a look inside?" "Yes." "No, thank you," she said instead. The older officer, now back at her side, let out a low chuckle. "No thank you." He looked at his partner, shaking his head. "Kids these days." "I Haven't done anything wrong, Penelope said, forcing herself to stand tall. The first officer sighed, like she was exhausting him. We got a call about a stolen vehicle matching this description. She almost laughed. Right. A black teenager in a nice car, that was the crime? That was always the crime. This isn't a stolen vehicle, she said. We'll see about that. Her hands curled into fists. This wasn't about checking plates. This wasn't about a misunderstanding. They'd already made up their minds the moment they saw her behind the wheel. The younger officer took a step toward her, one hand still resting on his belt. You sure you don't want to tell us the truth now? Save yourself a lot of trouble? Her heartbeat roared in her ears. She'd been here before. Not exactly here, not exactly like this, but close enough. Enough to know how these situations ended. Then, a low rumble cut through the tension. A second car pulling up. Not a squad car. A black BMW. Penelope's breath caught. The driver's door opened and out stepped David Richardson. Her father, dressed in a navy blue suit, his tie still neatly knotted from whatever late-night meeting he'd been in. His expression was unreadable, but his presence alone shifted the entire atmosphere. The officer stiffened. Penelope exhaled. She had never been so grateful to see him in her life. The silence was suffocating. David Richardson stepped forward, his polished shoes making soft, deliberate sounds against the pavement. He didn't move quickly. He didn't need to. He carried the weight of a man who was used to commanding rooms, his presence alone enough to change the air around him. His eyes, sharp and unshaken, swept over the officers before settling on his daughter. Penelope, he said, his voice calm, steady. Are you okay? She swallowed hard, nodding, but she didn't trust herself to speak. David turned, his gaze locking onto the officers. Is there a problem here? The older officer cleared his throat, straightening his shoulders. Sir, this is just a routine stop. We received a report about a stolen vehicle matching this description. David glanced at his daughter's car, then back at them. His expression didn't change, but the air around him did. A stolen vehicle, he repeated. His voice was smooth, controlled, but underneath there was something else. Something sharper. The younger officer nodded, arms still crossed. Yes, sir. We were just asking the young lady some questions, making sure everything checks out. David reached into his pocket, pulling out his wallet. With a flick of his wrist, he retrieved a business card and extended it toward them. The older officer hesitated before taking it. His eyes flicked down, scanning the embossed letters. Richardson Auto Group, the CEO and founder. A beat of silence. Then another. Penelope watched as the shift happened in real time. The realization, the understanding, the quiet, creeping embarrassment. David let them sit with it for a moment before speaking again. That Mercedes she's driving? He nodded toward the car. I sold it. My name is on the paperwork. I own the dealership that sold it. The officers exchanged a quick glance. David didn't blink. So, I'll ask again, what exactly is the problem here? The older officer coughed, looking anywhere but at David's eyes. Like I said, sir, we were just... David cut him off. You were just assuming that my daughter, because she is a young black girl driving a nice car, must have stolen it. The younger officer's jaw tightened. That's not what we said. You didn't have to, David replied smoothly. The older officer shifted uncomfortably, fingers fidgeting with the business card. Look, sir, we were just doing our job. If she had cooperated from the beginning, this would have gone a lot smoother. Penelope's fists clenched. Cooperated? She had done everything right. She had her license, her registration, her hands in clear sight. She had answered their questions. But in their eyes, it was never enough. David stepped closer, his voice dropping just slightly. You pulled over a teenager for no reason, treated her like a suspect, and now you want to blame her for how you handled it? He shook his head, exhaling sharply. Tell me, Did you even run the plates before making her step out of the car? Neither officer spoke. That was answer enough. David let the silence hang for a moment, then reached into his pocket again. This time it wasn't for a business card. It was for his phone. "I think it's time we get the mayor involved," he said, pressing a contact on his screen. "I'd love to hear his thoughts on why officers in his city are harassing black teenagers for legally driving vehicles their families own." The shift was instant. The officer's entire demeanor changed, shoulders stiffening, postures adjusting. The older one took a step forward, his tone suddenly more measured. "Sir, that won't be necessary. This was just a misunderstanding." David didn't even acknowledge the words. He lifted the phone to his ear. Penelope had never seen two grown men backtrack so fast. "Sir, there's no need for that," the younger officer said, his confidence cracking. "We were just about to let her go." David tilted his head. "You were just about to let her go? After making her stand outside in the cold, after treating her like a suspect?" His voice was calm, but there was steel beneath it. "If I hadn't shown up, would you have still let her go? Or would you have found an excuse to escalate?" Silence. That was the only answer he needed. David finally lowered the phone, studying them. The officers looked uncomfortable now, like they wanted nothing more than to be anywhere else. "We appreciate your cooperation, sir," the older officer said finally, trying to salvage whatever was left of his dignity. He handed the business card back, but David didn't take it. Instead, he let the man hold it, forcing him to keep standing there with his own mistake in his hands. David turned to Penelope. "Get back in the car, sweetheart." She didn't hesitate. The moment she slipped back into the driver's seat, she exhaled, her hands still trembling slightly. But as she watched her father handle them, watched how easily he dismantled their authority, something in her chest loosened. She heard the officers mumbling something to David, something about this being a misunderstanding. He didn't bother responding. He simply turned, walked back to the BMW, and got inside. The second he shut the door, Penelope let out a shaky breath. "Dad!" He held up a hand, his jaw clenched. "Not yet." She nodded. She understood. He needed a minute. The squad car pulled away first, its lights flickering as it disappeared down the street. Penelope gripped the steering wheel, watching it go. She should have felt relief. She should have felt safe. But all she felt was exhaustion. Her father finally exhaled, shaking his head. "You okay?" She nodded, but her throat was tight. She swallowed. "I hate this. I hate that this keeps happening." David's hands tightened on the steering wheel. "I know." She looked at him. "How are you so calm?" His eyes flicked toward her, the softness there cutting through the anger that still simmered beneath the surface. "Because I've been here before," he said quietly. "And because I can't afford to be anything else." Penelope let that sit for a moment, then turned back to the road. A part of her wanted to cry. Another part of her wanted to scream. But instead she took a deep breath, shifted the car into drive, and pulled back onto the road. The night wasn't over. Not yet. The tension in the car was thick, unshaken by the passing of streetlights and the occasional hum of another vehicle speeding by. Penelope kept her hands firmly on the wheel, eyes fixed on the road ahead, even though her mind was still stuck on the flashing red and blue lights that had filled her rearview mirror just minutes ago. She could still hear the officer's voice, still feel the weight of his scrutiny, pressing against her skin. David sat in the passenger's seat, his body angled slightly toward the window, but he wasn't looking at anything in particular. His phone rested in his lap, silent for now, but that wouldn't last. Calls were coming. He had started a fire, and soon enough people would notice the smoke. Neither of them spoke for a while. It wasn't until they reached their neighborhood, the gates parting smoothly to let them through, that Penelope finally found her voice. "This is never going to stop, is it?" David turned his head toward her. His expression was unreadable, but his silence was answer enough. Penelope huffed out a breath, shaking her head. It doesn't matter how many times we do everything right. Doesn't matter if we're polite, if we cooperate, if we keep our hands visible. None of it matters. They still see us the same way. David inhaled deeply through his nose, exhaling just as slowly. He didn't like saying things just to say them. When he spoke, it was with purpose. "No," he said finally, "it doesn't matter to them, but it matters to me." Penelope's grip on the wheel tightened. "Why? So we can keep pretending like it makes a difference?" His gaze lingered on her, soft but firm. "So we make sure they don't get an excuse to do worse." Penelope scoffed, her frustration bubbling up like boiling water. "They don't need an excuse. They make them up as they go." The weight in David's stare didn't shift. "I know." Her chest was tight, the anger sitting heavy inside her, like something alive, something clawing to be released. "I hate this," she muttered. David nodded once. "You should." She pulled into the long driveway of their house, the sleek modern lines of the property standing in stark contrast to the chaos she still felt burning under her skin. The garage door opened smoothly, welcoming them back into the illusion of safety. As soon as she put the car in park, she exhaled hard, letting her head fall back against the seat. David undid his seatbelt, but he didn't move to get out just yet. Instead, he turned to her fully, studying her carefully. "I know how you feel," he said, his voice lower now, more careful. "It doesn't get easier." She turned to look at him, her expression somewhere between exhaustion and resentment. "Then how do you do it?" He was quiet for a moment, then, with a faint shake of his head, said, "I pick my battles." Penelope let out a bitter laugh. "That's just another way of saying you let them win." David's jaw tightened. "No, it's another way of saying I know when to fight, in a way that actually matters." She frowned, tilting her head. "What does that even mean?" He held up his phone. Tonight wasn't the battle. Tonight was just the spark. Before she could respond, his phone screen lit up. Penelope caught the name before he answered. Mayor Anderson. David met her gaze briefly before swiping to accept the call, his voice shifting into something cool and professional. "David Richardson." A pause. Then, his lips pressed together slightly before he nodded. "I appreciate you calling so quickly." Penelope couldn't hear the mayor's words, but she could hear the tension in her father's voice. "No, I don't believe it was a misunderstanding," David continued, tone even. "I believe it was an all-too-common example of racial profiling, and I believe that if I hadn't shown up, my daughter would have been harassed further. Or worse." Penelope watched him closely, her heart hammering. There was another pause, and then her father's expression hardened. "Respectfully, Mr. Mayor, I don't need reassurances. I need accountability." He listened again, nodding slightly, but his jaw remained tight. "Good," he said after a beat. "Then let's make sure this doesn't get buried under excuses." He ended the call with a flick of his thumb and exhaled sharply, pinching the bridge of his nose. Penelope studied him, something settling inside her. Did he actually say he was going to do something? David slid his phone into his pocket and finally opened the car door. He said all the things people say when they're trying to keep something from turning into a PR disaster. Penelope followed him inside, her sneakers scuffing against the tile as they entered the kitchen. "So, what now?" David poured himself a glass of water from the dispenser, pausing only briefly before speaking again. "Now we make sure they actually do something." She raised an eyebrow. "And how do we do that?" David set his glass down and turned to her, a knowing look in his eyes. "We make noise." A flicker of something sparked in her chest, something beyond anger, beyond frustration, something sharper, something determined. She crossed her arms. "What kind of noise?" David leaned back against the counter, arms folding over his chest in a mirror of her stance. "You're young, you're smart, and you know how the world works now," He tilted his head. How would you get people to care? Penelope blinked, caught off guard. Her father had never talked to her like this before. Not like she was a kid he needed to protect, but like someone with power of her own. She thought about it. Thought about all the viral stories she'd seen, all the times people had used their voices to force real change. Then, her eyes flicked to her phone, still in the pocket of her hoodie. She pulled it out, unlocking it with a quick swipe. David nodded approvingly. Penelope took a deep breath, her fingers flying across the screen as she pulled up her camera and hit record. "Hi, my name is Penelope Richardson," she began, her voice steadier than she expected. "And tonight I was pulled over for the crime of driving while black." She didn't hesitate. She laid it all out. The stop, the questions, the assumption that she had stolen her own father's car. She didn't cry. She didn't shake. She spoke. She made noise. And within minutes of posting, the world was already listening. The first notification came within seconds, then another, and another. Penelope watched as her phone screen filled with comments, shares, retweets. Her story spreading like wildfire. The video she had posted wasn't just being seen, it was being felt. People weren't just listening, they were reacting. David stood beside her, arms crossed, his gaze flickering between her and the screen. He had seen things like this before, outrage that came in waves, headlines that burned hot before fading into the next big issue. But this felt different. This wasn't someone else's story. This wasn't a name they had read about in passing. This was his daughter. And it wasn't going away. Penelope exhaled sharply, glancing up at him. "I didn't think it would take off this fast." David nodded. People recognize the truth when they see it. The house phone rang, slicing through the silence. David didn't rush to answer it. He didn't need to. They both knew what it meant. Another notification popped up on Penelope's screen, this one different from the rest. Mayor Anderson issued a statement. Her breath caught as she tapped on the link, her fingers tightening around the phone. She read the words out loud. "In light of the disturbing incident involving Ms. Richardson, I am calling for an immediate investigation into the officer's conduct, as well as a review of our department's racial bias training procedures." She looked up at her father. "They're actually doing something?" David's expression was unreadable, but there was something behind his eyes, something careful, something knowing. "They're doing what they have to do to control the damage." Penelope frowned. "So you think this is just talk?" "I think it's a start," he said simply. "But starts don't mean much if they don't lead to something real." A buzz in her hands. "Another update? Chief of Police to hold press conference at noon tomorrow." Penelope swallowed. This wasn't just momentum. This was movement. She suddenly felt restless, like she had too much energy and nowhere to put it. She set her phone down on the kitchen counter, rubbing her palms against the fabric of her hoodie. "So, what do we do now?" David didn't hesitate. "We show up." Morning came fast, but sleep never did. Penelope lay in bed most of the night, staring at the ceiling, her mind replaying everything. The stop, the way their eyes lingered on her like she was a problem to be solved, the way they hadn't even run the plates before making her step out of the car. And then, her father's voice. "We make noise." She didn't realize she had fallen asleep until her alarm jolted her awake. Her phone was still warm from all the activity overnight. She had gained thousands of new followers, and her video had been viewed over 1 million times. She barely had time to process it before her dad knocked on the door. "You ready?" She sat up, pushing the covers back. She wasn't sure if she was, but that didn't matter. It was happening with or without her. By the time they arrived at the city hall, a crowd had already gathered. People held up signs, others held up their phones, and everywhere she turned, eyes found hers, recognition lighting up their faces. "Penelope, over here!" A reporter pushed through the crowd, microphone in hand. Penelope barely had time to react before her father's hand landed gently on her shoulder. "You Don't have to talk if you don't want to, he said quietly. She looked up at him. He had always protected her, always fought for her, always stood in front of her when the world pushed too hard. But now, she realized, she didn't want to be behind him. She wanted to stand next to him. She turned back to the reporter. I'll talk. The words left her mouth before she could second-guess them. The microphone was in her face before she could change her mind. Penelope, how do you feel about the mayor's statement? She inhaled. It's a step, but we've seen statements before. We've seen promises before. What we haven't seen is real change. We haven't seen real accountability. The reporter's eyes brightened. What do you hope happens next? Penelope didn't hesitate. I hope that officers who profile people who look like me face real consequences. I hope that departments stop treating bias training like a checkbox and start treating it like a priority. I hope, she glanced at her father before looking back at the camera, I hope the next black kid pulled over for driving their own car doesn't have to prove they belong in it. The crowd reacted. Cheers, murmurs, heads nodding in agreement. The reporter opened her mouth for another question, but before she could speak, the heavy wooden doors of City Hall swung open. The press conference was starting. The police chief stepped forward, flanked by two other officers, his face stiff, unreadable. He adjusted the microphone, cleared his throat, and began. Penelope barely heard the first few words. She already knew how these speeches went. But then, we failed Penelope Richardson. The words cut through the noise, through the air, through everything. The police chief's shoulders squared. And we failed this community. David's arms were crossed, but Penelope saw the way his jaw twitched. This was not the usual script. We can't undo the harm that's been done, the chief continued, but we can commit to being better, to doing better. A pause. And then, effective immediately, all officers in our department will be required to undergo expanded racial bias training. Effective immediately, we are revising our stop and search procedures to prevent incidents like this from happening again. And effective immediately, the officers involved in this stop have been placed on administrative leave, pending investigation. Penelope blinked. She hadn't expected that. Neither had the crowd, apparently. A ripple of surprised murmurs passed through the people around them, some exchanging looks, others nodding in approval. The press had their hands in the air, rapid-fire questions flying toward the podium, but Penelope didn't need to hear them. She had already heard enough. Her father turned to her, his expression softer now. Like I said, he murmured, it's a start. For the first time since the stop, something in her chest loosened. It wasn't everything. It wasn't a fix for the world. But it was something, and something was better than silence. Penelope looked out at the crowd, the faces that had shown up, the voices that had refused to let this disappear. She had made noise, and the world had listened.